and welcome to My Counselor Live. My name is Brittany East, and today we're having the pleasure of sitting down with one of our very experienced counselors, September Trent, to talk about a topic that doesn't seem to be addressed as often as it should be within the mental health world. But before we dive into that topic today, September, would you mind sharing a little bit about yourself for those who may not know you yet?
Definitely. Yeah, my name is September Trent, and I work in the Springfield, Missouri office with My Counselor. I've been working with our company for about 9 years, and I specialize in working with individuals with anxiety, depression, eating disorders, self-harm, women's issues, and just really have enjoyed my time here at MCO.
That's awesome. And thank you so much for sharing that background. That's really important work. I appreciate that there are people like you who have invested their lives into diving into some of these uncomfortable topics that really in society, it's not the most comfortable thing to talk about. So I
Yeah.
was really intrigued by the article that you wrote because I do feel like, it's not something I've struggled with myself or have experienced, but I feel like within the media, I feel like we see a lot of information about, how to prevent suicide, if you're dealing with suicide or suicidal thoughts. But your article is specifically called To Suicide Loss Survivors, so the people who are left behind. I'm really intrigued, like what inspired you to write this article?
Yeah, I'm so glad that I loved your intro. Thank you so much. Just because you're right, this topic, these individuals aren't talked about. They're kind of lost in kind of mental health. And so the reason why I wrote this article is because I've had lots of clients who have come to me and just wanted help with grieving and working through losing someone that they love, that they care about from suicide. And also this type of situation has a lot of stigma attached to it. So a lot of people that have lost someone from suicide, they will isolate, they won't talk to other people. So I really wanted to give them a voice and wanted to reduce some of the stigma around this topic.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that is what's important about the mental health community. It's really giving a voice to things that people aren't sure how to talk about or what to do.
Right.
So I know the title is To Suicide Loss Survivors. Is there anyone outside this topic that you wrote the article for, or was it just intended for those people?
It was mostly intended for those people, just individuals who have lost someone they loved, that they cared about, a friend to suicide. And I think it's important, just the reason why they're called survivors, because the grieving process is very different than other types of loss, like questioning why, or could I have done something more, really sets them apart. And so I think it's so important that they're called survivors, just because what they have to deal with through the grieving process. But I think it also can give light to just what it's like surviving something, or what it's like surviving losing someone who chose to take their own life.
Yeah. No, and I appreciate that you're trying to create a label that's helpful to I think to bring more awareness into all of the maybe confusing emotions that go into it, versus because if you lost someone, it's not necessarily your fault, but when someone, you lost to suicide, that survivor aspect, like you were kind of left behind and wondering, what happened.
Exactly.
So in your article, you do mention 5 ways that suicide loss survivors, how they tend to cope with loss. Do
Yeah.
you mind explaining, breaking down those 5 different ways and then giving advice on each of them?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the first way that I talked about is just the shock. Usually when someone hears that someone that they love, that they care about, had passed away due to suicide, they don't want to believe it. They question the validity of the information. They may also try to go to different places where that person was, just to make sure they're not there, just to question, it's like, is this accurate? They may even want to fight with that person, like, that cannot be my loved one, my friend would never do this. They may even refuse to believe it was suicide, trying to find another way, or something else had to happen. And so that shock is there. But there are some people that may be listening to this that it wasn't a shock. Maybe they've had a loved one or a friend who has dealt with suicidal thoughts, suicide attempts, mental health issues. And so unfortunately, it's not a surprise. They actually maybe are going more toward what we'll talk about in just a minute, about like asking the why and asking like, what could I have done more for my loved one, my friend. Just advice I would give for this specific step is just allow yourself to experience that shock. It is a part of the process. And even just to validate that, of course you would be shocked. No one wants to lose someone they love or care about to suicide. And you don't know how to grieve or like, what's next? Will I ever be able to go back to normal? So that's with shock.
Okay.
Yeah, the second piece of like grieving and like coping that I talked about was asking why. And this is something that individuals who are listening are survivors. They may have either like avoided this question, they don't want to face it, or maybe they continuously ask themselves this, why did this happen? And in reality, if they would really like admit it to themselves, it's just something that they're trying to focus on so they don't have to focus on the painful emotions that go into losing someone by suicide. And it can be really difficult to identify the why of suicide. A lot of times people will think that it's a very sudden event, but in all reality, very few suicides are a sudden event. Usually a catalyst happens that kind of catapults someone to really contemplating suicide, and then they complete it. But before that happens, there's been a lot of different events that has led to that catalyst. And like the survivors of suicide loss, they can focus on that catalyst as like, that's why they committed suicide when their family member committed suicide. But in reality, there was a lot of other things, pain and hurt that went into that. And so it's helpful to also know or understand about why people would attempt or commit suicide, is that they're trying to end a lot of pain rather than ending their life. And so having suicide loss survivors know that can kind of help with the process. Another question or another thing that suicide loss survivors really think about is, I should have known. And this is something that's very specific and unique to grieving someone you've lost from suicide. Just because survivors of suicide loss will go through all their interactions they had with their loved one, with their friend before they completed suicide, and ask and just dig through, what did I miss? What could I have done? Just to try to like make themselves feel better, or just try to figure out what happened. But, and this next part may be really hard to hear, but really the only people that are responsible for completed suicide is that friend or loved one that actually decided to end their life. And so unfortunately, you have to look at that piece of, my loved one, my friend was in so much pain that they chose to do that. And that's so difficult. And so I really would encourage people to, if they are struggling with loss of someone they love, care about from suicide, really seeking out individual counseling, because navigating, asking why, I should have known, those are really heavy things to deal with on your own. And a lot of survivors will want to isolate themselves, but that's really not what's helpful to them.
I have a quick question. So you're right, because after reading your article, I think that was really, because I was kind of reminded of like the stages of grief that people go to when they lose, a loved one or something else that's very significant in their life. But it seemed very specific, like the I should have known aspect. So when people are grieving, as a counselor, do you go with them through those questions? Is it helpful for them to even ask those questions, or is it helpful for them to do they do they have to go through those questions in order to accept that? Or I don't know if that question makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. It is helpful to go through those questions just
Okay.
because they're experiencing them, they're thinking about them, and if they don't get them out, their mind will go through them and there'll be more blame and guilt.
I
And
see.
so, yeah, so if they can share that with someone and feel comfortable, like my counselor, the person I'm sharing it with, accepts me, and I can ask these questions maybe I've been so afraid to ask, that can
Mhm.
help through like acceptance and then lead to, this is the guilt that I feel or the blaming of myself. And I want to look at that piece and work through it and then be able to let it go.
Okay. I
Yeah.
like to answer it. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. Well, yeah, and you talked about the grief. I mean, definitely grieving with losing someone that you love, care about to suicide, and everybody grieves differently. There are the stages of grief, and we go through those stages, but maybe it's different than someone else, or you may go back through the stages. It doesn't have to look the same for everybody. And if your grief process looks different than someone else's, that's okay. Don't think it has to look exactly the same. I really encourage you to allow yourself to look at the emotions that you experience in the grief. So it might be guilt, it might be blame, it might be sadness, hopelessness, hurt. Acknowledge that you're experiencing those things, and seek counsel from your individual therapist or a support group. And I'll talk about it in a little bit, just some resources for finding support groups for suicide loss survivors. But the most important thing to remember is your grief process may look different than the next person's or someone in your support group, and that's okay. That's okay. And then an emotion that suicide loss survivors experience is anger. And first, all I have to say to that is, of course, you would be angry. You lost someone that you love and you care about. So you may be angry with them. And that might be hard to admit, to look at, because when we lose someone, and by suicide, we try to look at all the good things about them. And that's okay, that's good. But we also have to acknowledge that we lost this person way before we were meant to, way before we wanted to, and we're upset about that. And also there could be anger at yourself because maybe you do feel like you missed something or something more could have been done. And so that blame and guilt comes back. And to examine those things, I encourage people to write down, like, what are you angry about? And a lot of times in therapy, we will go through those things and we will get angry together about those things and let those out, because anger isn't a bad thing. It's there. And if we don't talk about it, if we don't release it, it's going to come up in ways that we didn't expect.
Mm.
And then just the last piece is, I wanted survivors just to realize the resiliency that they have through going through the grief and looking at their emotions. There's resiliency in that, there's strength in that, and not to forget how proud they should be of themselves of working through all of these emotions, and even just having the strength to look at some things inside of them that they're scared to look at, that blame and that guilt, that anger. And most importantly, too, is just not to isolate themselves, going to individual counseling, but also a suicide loss support group. And a couple of good resources for those are the Suicide Prevention Lifeline. They have a website, Suicide Prevention Lifeline.org, and they have specific resources for suicide loss survivors, as well as the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. They also have resources for suicide loss survivors that I would just recommend going and looking at and trying to find a support group either close to you or online, because that support is so important and so needed.
Well, that's awesome. And I appreciate that. Like, you really want, it sounds like you just really want people to have a safe place. Like, if you are a survivor, to
Yes,
express all of the emotions and to go through all the emotions, like, not alone, like with
yes,
someone to bring them out.
yes.
Do you like, kind of went back to like those stages that are the emotions that people like have to, like, how they cope with loss? Do you feel like that also tends to like impact like their relationship with God, or feeling like they're really angry with God, or like
Mm.
ask God instead of like maybe redirecting the anger from themselves, but really redirecting it at God and asking him why, or feeling shocked by him? Does that seem to come up at all?
Yeah, definitely. There's definitely anger at the Lord, and it can even kind of change their relationship with the Lord and not spending as much time, or maybe that faith or trust that they had in him dwindles some. And so it's important that that person takes it to the Lord, because we're in relationship with the Lord, and we need to talk with him about the anger and the emotion that we have toward him, and ask that he comes in that with us and speaks to us in those specific situations, so we can feel his presence and know that despite this difficult event, he's still there with us. We may not have an answer why, or we may not get our loved one back, but we have the Lord with us through that grief. He's never going to leave us. He's always going to be there with us.
Awesome. Yeah. And it's just also good to know that you have someone there to kind of even work through those difficult emotions. I'm sure it's like difficult emotions with the person you lost, and then someone who you felt trusted maybe in, and maybe felt like that got broken. So
Yeah.
I just really appreciate like your heart to go in the mud with people,
Yes.
to kind of go on the other side.
Yes. That's a good word picture of just the mud, because it is mud. It is dirty, but it's good to get in there and work through it.
So what final piece of advice would you give to someone who is a survivor and who is like in the midst of this struggle right now?
Yeah. I would tell them that you're not alone. Unfortunately, I mean, we would hope that no one would have to go through this, but there's other people out there that understand your struggle and that want to come alongside you and want to support you as you work through the grief, as you work through all the different emotions. And I would tell them, if you have noticed that you're starting to isolate yourself,
Mhm.
make sure that you're reaching out to people that you care about or that understand, or just look for a support group or individual therapist, just because that's going to be most helpful to you as you navigate the things that you've experienced. Um, and just also knowing, like Brittany had said, just like with the Lord, he's there with you. He's not going to leave you, even though it can feel lonely at times.
Well, that makes sense. Well, thank you for that. And thank you yeah, for that article and for bringing that all in. We are going to transition now to another area that you do deal with that in your practice.
Yes.
It's a trending topic, which we do for each episode. This week's trending topic is the acronym, or it's called Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. It's a bit of a mouthful. Other people call it ARFID or just ARFID. Would you mind just kind of diving into like what is all that even mean?
Yes, definitely. I'm so glad that we're talking about this, just because it is trending, and we're seeing it more than we had in the past. So it used to be called selective eating disorder. So what happens is a person limits the type and amount of food that they intake, and they can limit this based on like food colors, textures, or smell. And also the person, because they aren't intaking enough calories, they are a very low weight, and their body struggles to function properly. Also, this is something that's diagnosed in children as well. And so they struggle to have the proper growth that they need and body development. And they avoid trying new foods. And so they have a very limited list of foods they will try. And it is important to note that this is different than anorexia, because in anorexia, the limiting of food is focused on losing weight, how your body looks, how much your body weighs. But this is different. It's more about the different types of food, colors, texture, and smell. And also the person, I guess it's helpful to know that this diagnosis wasn't in our previous diagnosis manual. It's more new to this more recent manual. It's been around, but they have just recently identified it as an eating disorder.
Okay, yeah, and that's interesting. I mean, because it sounds like more so it like that low weight and even the nutritional deficiencies is more of like it's a result. Like that's not the goal for someone who has this disorder. It's just
Right.
kind of like a side effect. Like they have this, and as a result,
Yes.
this tends to happen.
Yes.
So that was great. Yeah, clarity between those.
Yeah.
So why might someone even develop like avoiding and restricting all these different, very specific foods?
Yeah. So it can start out as like a child or someone being a very picky eater, but that's not all that ARFID is about. So it goes more into this fear of if they eat these types of food that they have labeled as bad, they may become sick, they may choke, they may die. And so as a result of this fear, some of them actually have a physical reaction where their throat like kind of closes up, or there's constriction of digestion, mouth tissues. And so that can lead to kind of this very physical reaction to it. And this diagnosis is diagnosed in children, adolescents, and adults. But research has shown that individuals with autism spectrum conditions, ADHD, and intellectual disabilities are more likely to have this disorder. And because of the fear, we often see anxiety disorder as well, diagnosed with ARFID.
That's interesting. So when someone comes to you, do they usually start out like they specifically have ARFID, or is it something that tends to just kind of come up in the package of like all these other stuff that like the autism or the anxiety or things like that?
Sure. Yeah, I've had both. Like I've had some people that have come and they know they have ARFID, they have been diagnosed previously,
Okay.
but have also had others who maybe have come in for something else, or they think it's another type of eating disorder, but it's actually ARFID because of it's not about body shape and size. It's more about why they're not eating these certain types of food and fears with the food. So it can be both, or I've had both.
Okay, no, that's good to know. And then I'm a parent, and so my kids aren't actually picky eaters, but that is a huge thing that parents worry about. Like, are my kids like eating enough? Or are we worried about? At what point do you think a parent kind of crosses the line from like, I think my kid's a picky eater to like, I think they might be struggling with ARFID? Like, is there a way to distinguish that at all, or is it kind of just getting advice?
So I would say to distinguish that, once you see that, kind of two things. Once, if they're refusing to try new types of food, you've tried a lot of different things, maybe even gone to your pediatrician of like, how do I help them try new foods? And they're refusing. Maybe you even see like a physical reaction, you see anxiety with that. But then also, if you're noticing your child isn't growing like they should, they're not gaining weight, maybe they're looking very thin, that's when it's time to go and talk to your pediatrician, your doctor about, hey, these are the specific issues that I'm seeing. What's our next step? Or if you think it's ARFID, it would be okay to try to find an eating disorder specialist or a therapist and getting their opinion.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really helpful.
Yeah.
So what advice would you give to someone though who they think they're experiencing or they are experiencing ARFID in themselves, or they have a loved one that might be experiencing ARFID?
Yeah. First, a lot of times when I've worked with individuals with this, they are so relieved that there's a name for what they're experiencing, because they're like, I'm struggling with this, and I know it's not anorexia, or I know it's not just picky eating. So there's so much relief. Okay, I am dealing with something. And so I would recommend looking for an eating disorder specialist, just because someone who understands eating disorders is going to understand this specific diagnosis and the anxiety that goes along with it. So when you go into treatment, that's a piece that's really going to be worked on, is that anxiety. So I know there's a lot of stigma around mental illness, eating disorders, but if you feel like you're struggling with this, there is help, there is treatment for it. Don't go it alone. Don't feel like you have to suffer by yourself. This is a newer eating disorder, and I think they just discovered it 20 or some years ago. And so there's not as much research as some of the other eating disorders, but that doesn't mean we don't have effective treatment for it or know how to treat it.
Awesome. Yeah, that's still super helpful. And I understand what you're saying. It's just good to know, like, oh wait, like there have been people like looking into this. Like, It's not like I'm an anomaly or something like that.
Right.
So that's awesome. So now we get to dive into viewer Q&A. I love this portion of our show because it gives the audience a chance to get their own questions answered. And for those of you who are watching, all these questions are viewer submitted, and you can go anytime online to MyCounselor.Online/ask. And when you submit your question, we share it anonymously. We answer it specifically to you, and you can submit your questions anytime, and they'll be answered either on this episode or a future episode. So the first question we have for you, September, the viewer says, I have never had a loved one die before. As my family members get older, I am getting more and more afraid of losing them. I have no idea how to cope with loss. What should I do?
Okay, yeah, such a good question. Of course, we are all scared of loss, losing someone that we love dearly. I'm not surprised that this viewer is like scared of. I'm really close to people that I love and my family members, and I don't want to lose them. So the first thing that I would just encourage them, rather than focusing on, I'm eventually going to lose this person I love, focus on the moments that you have with them now, really being mindful of the moments that you're spending with them, the activities that you enjoy with them. So if you're going to their house or doing an activity, making sure you're thinking about, what do you enjoy about this activity with this person? What are the things that you see around you that you want to remind yourself of? What are the emotions that you're experiencing with this person? Because you don't want to be so focused on the loss or not having them, and you miss out on these special times that you still do have with them. The second thing I would tell them is, think about right now. I know you haven't experienced loss, but how do you deal with difficult situations in your life, or like troubles that come up? Do you isolate yourself? Do you avoid them? Do you put them in like a mental box? Maybe you go head first and really want to tackle them, or maybe you are able to accept them? Trying to look at how do you approach those things, because if you're more tending to like avoid, isolate, or even like put them in a mental box, that's something you want to work on now, and look at and say, how can I not avoid these things? How can I look at some of these difficult things? Because when you actually do lose someone that you really care about, those are the things that you're going to have to look at and allow yourself to experience and accept that. Of course, you would be sad. Of course, you would experience the loss and the grief because it's someone that you cared about and you've spent a lot of time with.
That makes sense. And I appreciate that there is actually not like you totally prep yourself, because you don't know necessarily all the emotions you'll feel when you lose someone, but just kind of getting a reference point, like, oh, I do tend to be this way. So maybe like I can start trying to maybe get some new healthy coping mechanisms now, so that for this eventuality,
Yeah.
you'll kind of be a little more prepared.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
awesome. Okay. And so our next question for today, the viewer says, my sister and I have an extremely unhealthy relationship. It's been that way ever since we were kids. Now we're both adults and rarely talk. Would family counseling help?
Yeah, this is a good question, because I've had clients in the past that have had family issues and want to do family counseling. So I would say yes, family therapy would be helpful, as long as both you and your sister are willing to come to therapy and do the work to make the relationship better. Because a lot of times we'll get people that call in and schedule the appointment, or one of the sisters or one of the family members, but then the other one is kind of like, I'll just come for one time. Well, that's not going to be what's most helpful. One session isn't going to make your relationship better. And so in order for family therapy to work, you both have to be willing to come. You both have to be willing to listen and do the work that the therapist recommends. And part of this will include looking at some of the hurtful times and hurtful memories that you have with that person. So it's not going to be an easy process, but it is a process that will work if you're both willing and wanting this relationship to get better.
No, that's really good to know. And I'm just curious, as far as like family therapy, is there any difference when people experience that like through Zoom? 'Cause I'm sure a lot of people are not, like, or at least nowadays where people are very, like, families are split up and moved around different things. Does it still, you feel like it still works just as well, like doing a Zoom family therapy session?
Yeah, I mean, I think it works just as well. The only thing that I think we miss out on is when we're in the room with everybody, the interactions, we can maybe see them a little bit more clearly, rather than maybe if each person is in a different location, we don't maybe get as much emotional reaction as we would in the therapy office.
Right. That makes
But
sense.
also maybe both the family members or all the family members are on one screen, so we can still get that. But that can be something that might get in the way. I mean, sure, it'd be great if we could have everybody that we want to do family therapy in the office, but sometimes it's not always something that we can do. So Zoom is something that, we're thankful that we have, that we can use and help people that aren't in our location or aren't all together.
Awesome. Well, September, I really appreciate you coming on the show today, just sharing your wisdom, sharing your heart for people. It's very evident that you just really love people. You want to help people just to be, not necessarily be their best, but just like help them feel their best, like help them feel like they can handle what life throws at them and continue to move on. So I really appreciate you coming on today. For any of you viewers who have come up with questions watching this show or have other questions in a completely different field of therapy or mental health, please don't forget to submit them to MyCounselor.Online/ask. We love hearing your questions, love getting feedback, and very grateful for all of you. And if you are not already subscribed to our channels, you can follow us on social media at Facebook and go to facebook.com/lovemycounselor. Go to Instagram. Our handle is @lovemycounselor. And on YouTube, you can find us on youtube.com/MyCounselor.Online Christian Counseling. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next week for another episode of My Counselor Live.